Welcome back. Fewer than a dozen attorneys work for the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. But even with a small core of lawyers, the firm is making its mark by seeking out and often winning cases that set law-changing precedents. Deseret News editor Paul Edwards recently sat down with the firm's president, Bill Muma, and discussed their Supreme Court cases and why he's optimistic about the future of religious freedom in this country.
The Becket Fund for Religious Liberty has been so successful over the last several years at bringing these major cases dealing with religious liberty to the Supreme Court. Right. So I think in the last 3 terms, I think we've had 3 cases litigated by the Becket Fund.
That's right, yeah.
Just this week, or just very recently, there was an important case about prisoners' rights. Can you tell us a bit about how that went and what you saw in the courtroom?
Sure, Paul, I'm happy to. But I first have to say that getting 3 Supreme Court cases in 3 years for any institution, let alone a small operation like the Becket Fund, is pretty remarkable. And I was reading the paper this morning, and it's like the Utah Jazz getting to winning the NBA Finals 3 years in a row. And not to disparage Utah Jazz, but that's an unlikely thing. And we feel very lucky to have had this opportunity to go to the court and to win over and over. And we think we're going to win the Holt case that you just mentioned. So it's an interesting case. It's not an obvious one. The prisoner is in for life. There's nobody questioning his guilt or innocence. He's there for a reason. And he wants to wear his beard because he believes that's part of his religious exercise. And in 40, 42, 44, depending on how you cut it, but 40 plus states in the United States, he'd be able to do that. And the state of Arkansas thinks he shouldn't. And so it makes for a great question for the Supreme Court. Do prisoners have religious liberty rights?
Okay.
And we believe the answer is going to be a resounding yes. So
now,
we'll
as it came forward, my sense is that there was an interesting convergence of both what we might call right of center and left of center groups coming together on this litigation.
It really was. And the Becket Fund appreciates that, I think, more than anyone, because it's our conviction that religious liberty is not a political issue, not a partisan issue at all, that it crosses all the divides, religious and political. So it's very gratifying on the Holt case. We have the Obama administration filing an amicus brief in support of our argument, the ACLU filing on support of us, many conservative Christian organizations filing, Jewish organizations. So you have a real coming together, everyone supporting this prisoner's right. And again, it's not because the individual is so highly sympathetic. His behavior has been, very regrettable. He's in prison for a reason. It's because the principle is one that I think all Americans can embrace.
Now, my understanding is that this came under a statute
Yes.
that helped to shore up the rights of prisoners. Right. Last year, there was an important case litigated, the Hobby Lobby case, which also came up under a statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Right.
So, inasmuch as we have these statutes that are trying to provide for greater religious liberty, is there any threat that by obtaining robust religious rights in the courts under these statutes, that there could be a legislative backlash on those statutes in some way?
I wouldn't characterize it as a backlash so much as all 3 branches of the government have to be in accord before any of us should be comfortable. So we certainly wouldn't want an executive who was pulling away from religious liberty. We wouldn't want our legislature and the statutes to be pulling away from religious liberty, and we certainly wouldn't want the courts to be pulling away. But they can't pull towards it alone either.
Yeah.
So we have these statutes because there have been times when Supreme Court decisions have unnerved Congress, and they have tried to get in there and reinforce. That's been good. And I think we'll get the same result. I'm not worried about a backlash in Congress at all. So.
Okay. Were you in the court?
I was in the court, yeah. And I'm not a lawyer, so Paul, that's quite entertaining for me to be there.
Any observations about what you saw in terms of tone of the justices?
I can. I'm not a lawyer. I play one on TV. So this is the 3rd time we've gone to court. Hosanna Tabor, which was a 9-0 victory, which is considered the landmark case in religious liberty of late. And then Hobby Lobby, which you mentioned, and now Holt. And those are all H cases. So next year we're going to go to the I cases. That's our goal. But what I noticed, the difference between this Holt argument and the other two is when you go into the court, there's 9 justices and they interrupt immediately. They did learn their manners, I guess, but they cut off the lawyers right away and they begin interrogating the lawyer. And it seems impressive that they can answer these rapid-fire questions. In the Holt case, the tone was very different. There was very little interrupting for quite a long period as Doug Laycock made his argument. And then the questioning was very measured. And my takeaway from that is that the justices don't find the principle to be that difficult to embrace, and that they are supportive of the argument we made. Now, I might be overly optimistic, but I think it bodes well for the outcome.
Okay. Now, inasmuch as you're so closely focused on religious liberty and protecting it, what do you see as the major threats right now to religious liberty in our country?
Well, I'm an optimist on the religious liberty fight. I went to high school in Nebraska, and you see the storms coming from way far away, and they make a ferocious rattle and noise and wind on the way in, then they rain like crazy, and then they make a tremendous noise on the way out. And I don't know if it rains in Utah, but the point is that I think we're not at the beginning of the religious liberty storm, that in fact we're on the way out. And that if you look at what happened in the late 60s and early 70s, that was the entry. All the wind and noise, a lot of disruption around religion and religious liberty. And then we had that rising tide of political correctness and an erosion of understanding of religious liberty. And now we're at the next point, the break point, where everyone's waking up to the concern and focused on it. But we've seen the Supreme Court come in time and time again to support religious liberty. And I think the American people are very supportive. And then I've observed in my work in the Becket Fund across all of the religious groups. I mean, it's remarkable, the scope, come together. So my own view is we're going to get a contest, which is good in a democracy. We'll get a debate. We'll get some people who don't like the outcome and some who do. But when all the wind and storm is over, I think we're going to see the same enthusiasm for religious liberty that Americans have always enjoyed.
Bill Moomer there with editor of the Deseret News, Paul Edwards. Next, meet a woman of faith who breaks down stereotypes and helps folks live better lives when the Deseret News National Edition continues on KSL.